Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to today's seminar. And thanks everyone joining on Zoom. I'm standing in for Gabby Ares today. She couldn't be here because she's teaching, but she is the host for our speaker, Duan Biggs. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Duan. He's new to NAU and recently starting as the Alajos Gaslow Chair of Environmental Science and Policy. Prior to coming to the US, Duan was a senior research fellow at the Center for Planetary Health and Food Security and the School of Environment and Science at Griffith University in Australia. Duan has 2 decades of research project and consulting experience from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Australia on community-based conservation and governance. He has worked with the WWF and the IUCN, Conservation International, BirdLife International, and various government and community stakeholders on community-based tourism and conservation and on a community-based response to illegal wildlife trade. He leads an initiative with support from Luck Hoffman Institute and the IUCN to develop a standard for resilient human-wildlife coexistence in a COVID-19 world. Duan is also the founder and lead of Resilience Conservation, a group of applied conservation scientists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker this week, and let's give him a warm welcome to NAU. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. If you don't mind, I might just remove my mask while I'm talking. That way you might hear me better. If there are any concerns, please let me know. So yes, it's great to be here, back in the fresh blue skies and the snow. It's wonderful. So yes, I started in August last year as the Alajos Gaslow Chair, and spent a few months working from Southern Africa, and now I'm back here more thoroughly. And so the talk today is about, well, what environmental scientists, broadly speaking and defined, and in my mind, having worked across many disciplines and with many people that come from a forestry background, I see forestry scientists or environmental scientists in the broader categorization, dealing with a lot of the same and overlapping challenges that other environmental scientists deal with and that we as conservation scientists deal with, which is what I call myself. And so in a COVID-19 world, we're facing some serious challenges. And what are some of the challenges we're facing? I'm going to talk about my experience and what is our role and how should we tackle some of these serious challenges we're facing, and how can we better understand the world that we're currently operating in, which certainly for me, and I'm not sure, I would think many of the rest of you, the world is far more challenging and difficult than many of us would have imagined 20 years ago. So this is where I'm from, born in Namibia, the country in the green, then lived in South Africa for a substantive period of time where these animals like elephants and rhinos exist. Obviously, the icon Nelson Mandela is from there and played a very prominent leadership role in transitioning from white minority rule to a democracy. And in my work there, I spent a lot of my time on community-based conservation efforts, working with individuals like these, Eugene, Gilbert, and Willie, who you can see there. And they were, from what in South Africa is called previously disadvantaged communities. So really not getting any support or very much support at all from the apartheid government. So we were looking at initiatives of providing capacity for them to engage in conservation and tourism. And in this instance, in this project, we were focused on training them up as bird watching guides and site conservation individuals. So after in 2012, to zoom forward, I moved across to Brisbane, Australia, firstly to the University of Queensland to do a postdoc with Hugh Possingham, who for a few years, up until I think it was last year or the year before, was chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy as well. And that was really a good place to be based because it was one of the world's leading hubs for conservation science. And so lots of connections with organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the IUCN, and there I got more and more involved in the more sort of international policy side of things and policy side of some of the serious conservation challenges we're dealing with. In particular, I would say, perhaps sucked into the response to the illegal wildlife trade. And in that, there was a strong drive by groups, particularly groups and NGOs in Western countries coming out of the United Kingdom, the United States, to really tackle the issue of poaching of elephants and rhinos and other iconic animals with bans. And, let's just try and stop this. Let's try and close down these markets. And in working with groups like the International Institute for Environment and Development and subgroups of the World Conservation Union, or IUCN, from my perspective, was really looking at, well, what are the rights of the local people that live with these animals, that perhaps depend on them, that may have a history of hunting them and using them, and now that's connected to a modern world of supply chains. And how do we engage in managing this challenge of the illegal wildlife trade to respect their rights, but also find solutions that are more sustainable? We know that if one bans something from up high, but actually you don't have local support, or you haven't thought through, well, what does that mean for the local people on the ground? It's probably not going to work. So I spent a lot of time working on that. And in that work, and I engaged in many international fora, such as the Convention of Trade in Endangered Species and others, I found that we really have some serious challenges in dealing with these issues. And these challenges have come to the fore again during the pandemic. And the challenges are the inequities across scales in society, within and between countries. And these are combined with societal polarization and the challenges facing science-informed decision-making really pose challenges for us as environmental scientists. So let me talk a little bit more about these challenges. The inequity. So in the space of wildlife conservation, what is happening in a lot of my experience is people living in luxury and, from high income parts of the world, in places like that, who feel strongly about conserving lions and elephants, have the power and are able to kind of dictate, well, what the policies are and what action should be implemented for people who live with lions and elephants, who live like, in substantive poverty like that. What is acceptable and what is not? Is the use of lethal force and hunting to kill an elephant if it's raiding crops that these people depend on? Is that appropriate or is it not? But the people on the ground often don't have much, they have very little resources. They don't have the capacity to engage in the debates. And they're led often and dominated, and the discourses and the policies are dominated by people living in wealthy urban areas, often in Western countries. But without real understanding of what the context is and what the reality is of living with elephants. And this poses a real challenge to finding sustainable solutions to conserving what really are our global public goods, animals like elephants, lions. So in talking about equity and inequity, in the past few years, we've really seen a lot of protest action and other action taken, and a lot of attention being drawn to the issue of inequity and what we need to do to deal with it. So certainly a lot of attention to inequities across races in this country as well as some others. What should we be doing about this in the international NGO arena, in the United Nations arena, which I spent some time working in, a lot of emphasis on gender inequity and how we deal with that. In terms of hiring staff as well as projects. But there is another type of inequity that is in some ways, very deeply structured and entrenched. And in terms of looking at the statistics of its impacts, has in many ways a bigger impact than, inequities between races in countries or between genders. Would anyone like to take a guess of what the driver of that inequity is? Any guesses online? I don't know if the people online are able to say anything. Not sure. All right, well, map of the world. Countries, nation states. This is the largest driver of inequity in many ways. I've seen it in my work. And I can imagine, I mean, I've done quite a lot of reading about this, the history of, how nation states came about. Nation states are a construct like any other construct for managing society, and, deciding, well, where do we make rules? Who do those rules apply to? And the thing with nation states in this era where we're all talking about dealing with inequities, Financial Times has stated that it's the passport with which you are born with is by far the biggest determinant, more than your intelligence and anything else, of what your expected income will be in your life. And then if we go back, well, where does this notion of a nation state come from? What's the origin? In my reading of it, and I'm happy to talk to others who may have a different reading of history, it comes from the European colonial era, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. Before that, nation states, societies, certainly in continents like Africa, where I'm from, didn't organize themselves in nation states with passports and rights associated with them. It was very different. So the world we see today and the divisions we see between countries that manifest in the world I operate in comes from, a construct that's now very deeply structured and entrenched in the world around nation states. So if we look at Africa, my home continent, in the late 1800s, this is how the various European powers carved it up. Drew lines between where tribes had been living for centuries, just drew borders right between the middle of tribes without any consideration of them, and actually then decided where those borders would be in a conference in Berlin without any people present there at all. And those borders decided then still stick now. And the people in Africa have to deal with them. And have serious issues and bring up lots of challenges in the conservation and broad environmental and development space. So if we look at the conquest of the world more broadly, looking beyond Africa, so, the countries that were the colonizing powers there in Black Western Europe and, into Eastern Europe, and then the parts of the world that these countries dominated. You can see Australia, various, countries at different parts of Africa. Spain obviously had more land in Central and South America. And then if we look at that map and we look at, well, where does the wealth of the world lie now, today? And with one or two exceptions, you can see the wealth sits in those former colonial powers and in the countries that the people of those origins managed to dominate. They weren't, effectively forced out over time, like Europeans were largely in Africa or in parts of Asia, some countries like Australia, Canada, the United States, where the settlers from Europe managed to dominate the society. They're culturally connected, very culturally close to the former colonial powers. That's where the wealth sits. And this has important manifestations in our work and the challenges we deal with today and how we deal with them. And in the African context, as well as the Southeast Asian context, and I've tried to understand some of it because probably many of you are thinking now, but don't just blame the colonizers. It's the African countries themselves are very corrupt. This is very true. And some colonized countries have done very well. This is also true. However, there is quite a lot of research showing that if one looks at the behavior of, say, Europe, post-independence, and one can certainly look, if one looks back at the way decolonization and independence was granted to countries in Africa, which I'm most familiar with, it certainly was not done with, well, let's think, how can we give the resources to these countries and build capacity so they can actually run functional countries? It was more, look at what the United Kingdom, for example, did in Rhodesia and then Zimbabwe. It was, what's the easiest way for us to get out? Lowest cost, let's go. And then, well, they can deal with the problems later. They no longer our problem. And then post that, in terms of development aid flowing from Europe, a lot of, there's all this money flowing, but who's it actually serving? Is it actually serving building democracy in post-Cold War Africa, or is this actually about benefiting the European donors? And then research showing that, well, once the society has been colonized, because the leaders are seen to be illegitimate, it breeds a culture of illegitimacy. People feel it's appropriate for us to try and break the rules because the leaders aren't our leaders. Why should we listen to them? And that makes it very difficult to govern a society. And one can see these the consequences today in terms of inequity. So here's a list of high-income countries, many of them in former Europe, where they were colonizing powers, and then some countries in Africa on the lower income end of the scale. And you can see, well, 50 to 60 times differential in average income of a person in those countries. And if one then compares that to some of the deep inequities in the United States, well, there are serious inequities between, this is a income by race group. And it's, if what defined here by the census as white individuals nearly twice, or have an income nearly twice as high as Black individuals. That's a serious problem which needs to be addressed. It's twice as much, it's not 50 times as much. So if we're serious about dealing with inequity at a global scale, we need to consider these inequities between nation states. Right, so come 2020, we're all having hopefully a good time in early 2020, I certainly was, and come the pandemic, and our world gets upended. And the challenge of the pandemic manifests on top of these pre-existing challenges that I've just spoken of. So the pandemic has caused some serious issues, to everyone. And in lower income countries, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, over 100 million people have been pushed back into poverty. That's a serious impact. There's also across the, speaking about the nation state divides, where that comes from, vaccine inequity. This is a real serious issue. High income countries, this is data from 2021, but I've looked at more recent data, didn't get time to put it in here, but the inequities persist. Vaccine surplus in high income countries, vaccine shortage in lower income countries. And we're dealing with a global pandemic. It doesn't, to actually solve this, it's not going to help the rich countries just vaccinating everyone if they're able to do that in their countries, because there's movement of people. The virus doesn't see these borders. So here's another graph. There is, the vaccines administered. As you can see, the low-income countries are pretty low down compared to the upper middle income and the upper income countries. So here's some more data. High income, this is from July 2021. 1 in 2 people vaccinated in high income countries, and over 50%, 1% vaccinated in low income countries. So we have these inequities between countries. And now in my work, I've dealt, as I mentioned, with, well, how do these inequities manifest in terms of policy making to conserve wildlife, is what I'm talking about more today. And on top of that, now we have the challenge of polarization, which in this country, a lot of people are aware of, because it's sort of in your face as soon as you look at the news, whichever side of the news you're looking at. And this has been defined by some scholars as the area of post-truth politics and polarization. So what that entails is that debates are framed largely by appeals to emotion and identity. Tribalism takes hold around debates and issues, as I've certainly read some analyses that is happening with the vaccine debates in this country. It becomes tribal. I identify with this group, therefore I get the vaccine or I do not. And the science around, and the details of science around, high profile issues doesn't, that becomes of very much secondary importance, or very little importance in entirety. And false facts are reported and used by the different sides in these debates. So then this, certainly when I was reading through and understanding this challenge, I was like, well, we're scientists, we're scholars, we're researchers, we're meant to be trying to work out how the world works and using that knowledge to inform society. Well, how should we better deal with the challenges we have? But if science is being challenged, misconstrued, and often ignored, then what is our role? If what all this work we're doing to, understand the world better, and the society doesn't want to hear it, well, then what are we doing? So it's a real challenge. So trying to understand the challenge better, I found this book by Eric Lowe, Media and the Political Process. So this was this was written in 2014. And so prior to really some of the impacts of social media that we've seen politically. But I thought it was a really good, and I managed to link up with Eric later on and actually had some good discussions with him. It was a really good descriptive of, well, why have we got into this state of very sort of sensationalist media, very dumbed down to death news and discussion of what are really complex issues. And so Eric describes that very well and describes the incentive structures. And if you're he describes it from a politician. If you're a politician in this world, if you want to survive, you've got to be sensationalist, which means you're incentivized to become more and more extreme in whichever, policy angle or perspective you take, because that's the way the news picks you up. That's the way you then get more attention. That's the way you might get elected in your party. That's the way you'll then get more funding and build your political career. So it's like, well, that's understandable. These people are just individuals are responding to incentives, but it poses a real problem for the functioning of society. And similarly, in the environmental science and conservation space, in this world, for organizations to survive, established multinational conservation NGOs, imagery, media, and social media need to be very carefully managed. And your image and how you're able to attract media attention around what you're doing is much more important in terms of your survival and growth as an organization than on-ground results of finding lasting solutions. So simple, emotive, and sensationalist messages are favored over the nuanced detail necessary for good policymaking in most instances, particularly if we're dealing with, complex issues in different parts of the world that just don't, that aren't black and white at all. And so I've certainly dealt with some of these challenges in my space, and they make life really hard. And in particular, over the last 2 years, I've been looking at the combination of inequity between countries and the response to the pandemic, specifically within the response to wildlife trade. And it's a very nasty combination. So wildlife trade is thought to play a role in the emergence of COVID-19. Scientists are still debating, well, to what extent did it play a role? But certainly the balance of scientific evidence is, well, the way wildlife is traded globally is a real challenge for the emergence of possibly new, risky diseases that may cause future pandemics. So how should we respond to this threat? Should we try and ban it all? Or should we try and regulate and manage it better? What should we do? And so there's been a real push coming out of NGOs, charities in countries like this one, like the United Kingdom, coalition to end all the trade. And let's stop this trade in wildlife completely because, well, it's bad for the animals. We don't like the idea of someone trading in something as cute as a pangolin. And also it may cause pandemics. So the policy position is let's close all commercial supply chains by securing and enforcing permanent bans on markets and trade. And so often these are driven by well-intentioned groups from wealthy Western settings with little understanding or connections with complexities on the ground. So like in my work on the rhino horn trade, if you ban the rhino horn trade, but the people living next to the rhinos are earning, if they're lucky, $1,000 a year, and by poaching a rhino, they're going to make $100,000 a night. Well, then your ban's not going to be very successful unless you have really draconian and expensive enforcement. And if your ban does not consider that context and does not consider developing real alternatives, well, then it's probably not going to work. And if anything, it's probably going to make it worse because it pushes things underground. And this is also a challenge in the space. And then there's been the perspective raised, but what about the rights of indigenous people to trade wildlife? They've been doing this for millennia. And the response is no, but the ban is specified in commercial trade. So in some of my discussions with these groups is right, okay, so maybe in a country like Australia, the line and the boundary between what is subsistence for indigenous people and what is commercial is quite clear. Yet with my work in Asia and much of Africa, that's a very, very blurry line. Who is not indigenous is highly contested. People disagree on that. What is commercial and what is subsistence also isn't very clear at all. That's settings like Central Africa, Southeast Asia, are where our higher pandemic risk lie. So, we have to spend a real long amount of time and a lot of resources to understand that distinction. But there doesn't seem to be much focus on that. Then there have been quite a few papers out on the views of people who depend on wildlife trade and consumption are not considered, so therefore it's inequitable. And as we've seen, I mean, there's various debates. People, there's a contentious issue, but I've looked into the literature on it, the illegal drug debate in this country, lots of scholarship on, well, all right, it's not as easy as let's ban this and then problems go away. You may reduce use by some groups, but there's serious societal consequences, both within the United States and in other countries. So as a societal problem looked at more broadly, there's no simple fix to that. And similarly with this, and as I've spoken with my disease ecology colleagues, so bad practices in wildlife trade hold disease risk. Now, if you try and make it illegal, or you make it illegal, but you don't enforce it properly, and you don't actually work with the people, and when I say the people, I mean both the communities and the people responsible for enforcement. In many of these settings, these are post-colonial settings, people, the enforcers themselves are like, well, these rules don't really make sense. And that's my family friend. I'm not going to put them in jail for doing this because the rules are silly. So if we actually want to ban these things, we've got to actually understand how those people might see such a ban. And those efforts aren't really taking place. And if we don't do that, all that would happen is the trade goes underground, which from a public health perspective is even worse, because then no control, no understanding of what the conditions are in which this trade is happening. So, but some of my work then over the past years really looked at some of the solutions we already have that we can use to address this challenge. So when you buy anything, this bottle of water even from the supermarket, if you look at the standards of certification that the producers require along the supply chain to get it into the store, some serious food safety standards there. These came into place after World War II. And they have been implemented in some cases with some species and in some countries on the wildlife trade. So what we can do, I mean, there are some trades in wildlife that we should just stop. And one should ban them and one should enforce against them and certain practices that need to be stopped. But I don't think it's feasible to try and ban it across the board, but in which case we need to improve practice. And we can look at existing food safety standards for supply chains to do that. So this is a little piece we wrote in the Lancet Planetary Health with some colleagues from the IUCN and the Wildlife Trade Monitoring NGO Traffic. And then from that assembled a team of Hernan Caceres, Carlina Indriswari, moving from left to right. She's from Indonesia, worked on the wild bird trade. Alex Braskowski from South Africa, and Hubert Chung, who did a lot of work on the rhino horn trade in China, to see, well, what are the options? What systems are already in place, and what are the options for adapting these systems to improving management of the wildlife trade more broadly? Yet the response to this has not been very good. It's sort of been, well, you can't really talk about that because you're just giving the people who want to trade wildlife an excuse to do so. And the push for a widespread ban continues to this day. I'm getting messages from policy discussions. It's ongoing. And so standing back, I mean, this is obviously very frustrating that I feel our conservation sector in particular is really not able, it's broken, it's not able to deal with the nuances of this global challenge. And what we as a sector say we're trying to achieve, if you look at the websites of, the big NGOs, the United Nations, we're not doing a very good job of achieving those objectives at all. We're failing. And why is this happening? I'm trying to understand that. Well, I've spent quite a lot of time trying to understand that because it's very challenging working in this space. And so here's a very simple schematic. One lens, granted, it's one lens only of why we're in this position. And I think one of the sort of the drivers of this is the challenge of the interaction between global inequity and polarization. So one of the issues is going back to what I said earlier about where the wealth lies and how decolonization happened, and how, I mean, one could certainly make the argument for, in some ways, the colonized countries, say in Africa, were not set up to work as countries. They were set up to stay weak and poor, because that makes it easier for wealthier countries to exploit them. And so that means that if we want to conserve lions in a country like Zambia or Zimbabwe, then the money to do so probably has to come from a wealthy country like this one, or the United Kingdom. So now, and this typically, because of capacity, happens through, let's say, an international NGO or international charities that, you know, raise money from wealthy people in this country or in the United Kingdom. They raise the money and they, you know, sell, for use of that term, projects on the ground in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Cambodia to improve conservation and community outcomes on the ground. However, because of the state of polarization we're in and the lack of nuanced discussion, and the fact that there's a very weak connection between what happens on the ground back to the actual donors, you know, what becomes more important, and I've seen this over and over again, is maintaining, for your organizational survival, your incentives on keeping your images, stories of success back to your donors very looking good. So you keep getting the flows of money. And then what happens on the ground, unless you really behave very badly, you know, that's kind of lesser importance. And there's increasingly, in my experience on the ground, in places like East and Southern Africa, people on the ground are getting upset. They're like, we don't want these NGOs anymore because they self-serve and they're not helping us. And so this is in the international conservation environmental space, this is a real challenge that we're dealing with. And this is one of my lens to try and understand it. So coming towards the end of my talk, and very recently when I was working from South Africa, where my family are, helping my sister look after nephew and niece, the Omicron ban came. And this is just yet another example of the challenge of inequity across nation states. So from a conservation perspective, a natural resource management perspective, this is a scene from Olifant's Rest Camp in the Kruger National Park, where I was lucky to spend a lot of time growing up and then also working later on. This is a conservation land use. It depends on tourism, income from tourism to maintain it. There's a lot of, actually, there's been a really nice expansion of conservation land use around the Kruger National Park. A lot of private landowners saying, we don't want to keep cattle anymore, we're not going to plant crops, we're going to convert back to conservation land and conserve wildlife because we can bring international tourists and we can fund ourselves that way and we can look after the environment. So, and when I was traveling around South Africa in November, talking to lodges, etc., people were saying, well, this pandemic has been really hard. You know, a lot of my neighboring lodges have gone out of business, but luckily this December's coming, that's peak season for us. And then the Omicron bans came, the United Kingdom is a key source market, and they were like, all right, this is it. We're gonna have to get out of this. Let's go back to farming cattle or planting maize, because at least we're in charge. So it's posed a real challenge for maintaining tourism-funded conservation land use. And here's some of the news that you would have seen, you know, lots of people in the United Kingdom and here as well, holiday travel plans in limbo as a growing list of countries introduced bans. And then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, well, Southern Africa is last in line for vaccines, but first in line for travel bans. And then came out only a few days later was, well, actually, because South Africa's got so many issues with many diseases and it's a fairly advanced country, been dealing with HIV at high levels for decades, very good at identifying variants and understanding viruses. So South Africa, the scientists there and the health department were transparent about discovering this variant. Actually, it seems as though it was circulating for longer elsewhere. It was in Europe before it was detected in South Africa, and South Africa was open to and transparent with, we've detected this, which certainly the world has complained about some other countries, in the earlier stages of the pandemic, not being transparent. And so then certainly very much in the narrative and the news there was, well, we were transparent, unlike some other countries, and we're getting punished for it. So next time we're not going to say if we find anything, because, you know, it doesn't help us at all. We only get punished. And these are some of the African leaders speaking out saying, well, you know, the narrative is, well, we're basing our decisions on science. We're meant to be transparent. president of South Africa, but when the moment comes, then the wealthy resort to their own self-interest and ban travel from Southern Africa. And, the Minister of Environment and Forestry in Namibia, where they're even more dependent on nature-based tourism, felt, well, these bans lack scientific basis, unacceptable, discriminatory, and in contradiction of guidance from the World Health Organization. So, but if one looks at the decision-making of, say, leaders in the United Kingdom, where the ban was introduced, they're responding to incentives from their voters. So they feel, well, geez, there's a new variant. People think Africa is a mess anyway. Let's just ban it. It's going to be simpler. Otherwise, I suffer potential political risk. So it's understandable for leaders in, say, the United Kingdom to make those decisions. However, as a broader global society, this does not put us in a good position to manage, this ongoing pandemic or future pandemics. So I've raised many challenges. I've got some initiatives I'm working on that I think can potentially address some of them, but I don't have time to go into them today. I'm happy to talk to any of you later about what I'm doing. So I'd be, looking forward to your inputs. And these are some of the questions I'm still struggling with. I'm new in Flagstaff in the region. I'd be very interested to hear about similar issues plagued by inequities and polarization that you might be dealing with. Any thoughts you may have on what can we do about the deep structural inequity between nations in our work, where we're ultimately looking to build a healthier global society and global environment? How do we deal with this challenge of bringing science to the table in our very polarized world? And what sort of institutions and processes should we look at to make this work? Because certainly the ones we have in place right now are really failing to a large extent in doing so. So thank you. Look forward to your questions and inputs. Do I need to do anything with the Zoom?
If something comes up in the chat.
All right, you're managing
I
that.
can read it out.
Beautiful.
Go ahead and raise your hand. I can bring down the mic if it's necessary, but I can also just repeat. Yeah.
Or I can put these questions back up to, or comments or criticisms, disagreements. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
I'm used to shouting in class.
Right.
So something I don't understand fully, I don't know the data on it, is just really how widespread in society the skepticism and pushback against science is. Certainly with news, we often see extreme viewpoints amplified for various reasons. But I wonder what the data shows in the US or Australia or South Africa or anywhere about how widespread that skepticism is, given that science has helped us build this incredible world, that has made our lives much more comfortable.
Absolutely.
You know anything about that?
I think that's also very issue dependent. So the wildlife trade is obviously highly contentious. Elephants, lions, tigers get people emotive. And so I think my sense is in that space, there's a deep skepticism for science. It's very polarized. It's like we've decided on our position based on our values or ideologies is what we're going for. And science that doesn't agree with that is ignored. If it agrees with that, it's used. If it doesn't, it's ignored. I understand in other spaces that are perhaps less contentious, it's better. I mean, there's some interesting work in the discussion we'll have in the class after this, the paper that we published in Science a few years ago on the manifestation of this polarization and different values on finding a solution to the elephant conservation challenge and fights over whether you should be able to trade in ivory or not. There, I was looking into some of the research. So for example, gun control in this country, a very contentious issue as well. Some of the research there shows that the more educated you are, so people with a PhD that are pro or anti should have the right to own weapons, are less likely to be convinced by any science because they've got the intellectual machinery to convince themselves that, well, actually, whoever did that was biased. So that was interesting. So I think that's a very good question. It'd be fascinating to find data on that and to actually see what it is and across different spaces. Certainly, I feel in my space, in my work, internationally, things like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was done, around the turn of the century. I mean, that the sort of thinking behind that we're just going to do a scientific assessment and this is going to inform policymaking. I mean, I sort of feel that's now very much perceived as naive. That's not how it works. And so, but yeah, no, getting more data on this would be fascinating, and from different countries and different contexts. Yes.
So one of the things, as you were talking about, more specific to standards and practices around wildlife trade, made me think of the notion everything in moderation, including moderation, because it sounded a little bit like there were some instances where outright draconian bans do actually make sense when properly applied in like a specific context.
Absolutely.
What are some of those contexts that you've identified in your work where, yeah, just outright banning it makes sense even with those, global contexts?
Right. I think that's a very good question. So if one looks, and then more from a conservation angle, which I've worked in for more years, vicuña, the camelid in Latin America, was down to fewer than 10,000 animals. I forget when that was, late 70s. So they instituted a ban against, hunting them, getting their wool, selling that on. That allowed the populations to recover, and it was well enough implemented so that now there's a very healthy and vibrant sustainable use operation, and local communities are benefiting from that. So that's certainly one example. So I think, and certainly if one looks at animals like the Javan rhino, which are down to less than 50 individuals, I mean, I think anyone who thinks you should be allowed to trade that animal, they're not thinking straight. That should not be a case in which it can happen. But so, and there in Indonesia, they've got relatively good systems of enforcement, it seems, around that issue. Again, in India, where I've done some work there, the cultural position and the sort of the structural context is not as that. It's not a hunting society as much as many African societies are. So there, a ban is almost culturally enforced already. And so, so then there you can think, all right, well, how should we, there's 5,000 or 6,000 Indian one-horned rhinos now. Should we allow sustainable use of them? There's probably enough. And you're like, well, actually, the society here doesn't really want it. It could open a can of worms, so we don't have to do that. Whereas in Southern Africa, the whole conservation industry and land use is based on sustainable use and hunting. And there are people kind of feel it's their right. And any imposition to that right, they feel, well, okay, now you're saying I can't do what's my right, now I'm just going to break the law anyway. Like then, so in that context, you'd have to think very differently about it. I mean, and I think one of the things here, and at a deeper level, and I've got some other slides from Lynn Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago that I had the fortune of working with. It's just some governance principles. If you want to get people in a local community here or people living anywhere to do something, not chop down the forest next to where they live, you should go and talk to them and hear, well, why are they chopping it down? Are they concerned about it? How should you engage with them so that they maybe chop it down more sustainably, or, harvest more sustainably, or stop chopping it down? You've got to engage them. You've got to understand their context. And in many cases here, that's not happening. And that's at an underlying level a real issue. Do the people online have the ability to ask questions? Yes?
They do.
Okay.
Nothing's come through yet.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, just kind of building on your question 3 up there, I think, as far as the science policy interface goes, I know a few years ago it was I was being taught basically as a scientist, if you want to see change beyond just putting your data out there and the results, that you need to kind of, if you're not necessarily advocating for policy but trying to influence it, that you need to like acknowledge your biases as soon as you're kind of brokering your results and these kind of things. But now, as things have become more polarized and sensationalist, do you see that being still the best route to take? Or as scientists, do we need to play ball in the sensationalist realm? Obviously that seems anti-values as scientists, but where do we move forward if even the more recent acceptable paradigms for that change are not working?
I think there's very different roles to play. I think there's certainly, on any issue, there's room for hardcore campaigners who go out there and shout their cause on whatever cause it may be. And some of them may draw on science. And I know some of the effective scientists in influencing policy would talk to those groups at some point and would, perhaps say, well, here's some science that you could use to further your cause, but I'm not publicly associated with you. So that the noise is out there. The noise is important on some of these issues, because if it's not out there, that's a walkover for the other side. But then as a scientist, you can decide, and there's numerous individuals one can look to, be like, well, the scientist has positioned themselves as taking whatever it is, a pro-sustainable use of wildlife stance. Or the scientist has positioned themselves as taking an anti-sustainable use stance, clearly. And they're kind of behaving, yes, they do have scientific credentials, but they're behaving more like campaigners and just using their science in that line. Or you have other scientists that are a lot more, they're like, look, there are these different perspectives. I have my biases, but let's try and understand them. So you're still playing that brokerage role, but acknowledging that, we are dealing with a sensationalist environment, which does make policy making more challenging. I think one of the things that really helps with this, and in terms of the work I'm trying to do now, if one works locally, then it's much easier to find common ground, because literally you have common ground. You're talking about, well, what are we going to do about, the valley that we're all living in, these mountains that we all love? And there'll be different perspectives on that, but you've got some common ground to work with. Where when you're talking about global issues that are contentious, like wildlife trade, not rooted in a specific place, lots of room for, there's big political economies and flows of money around the various causes, one side and the other, it becomes a lot more challenging. Yes?
So kind of playing off of that, but also your first question here, I mean, I don't have experience like with global. I used to work for an indigenous tribe that was working with an NGO, and the issue there was, their entire territory had to Forest Service land. So they have no jurisdiction for, over the last century or whatever, but they're able to say. And they're starting to flip that around by collaborating with the larger facilities like NGOs. And I think what works in that situation, what has worked is that the tribe, the NGO knows that they cannot misrepresent tribal interests. And the tribe has the ability to go to the head of the Forest Service and complain, or go to the media and complain. And they've had articles in the Guardian, they've had, close-door meetings with the forester. They are empowered. So I think that making sure that those relationships are genuine in a large way is making sure that those local communities have the ability to make their voice heard when it's been misrepresented.
No, that's a very good point. And certainly in my experience, I think, and again, this comes back to the nation state construct. So indigenous communities, tribal communities in Australia, Canada, the United States, more functional, better governed countries as compared to, say, Zimbabwe, and also better resourced. Those communities have, they've got legal processes they can follow. There have been efforts to build capacity within those communities for some time. They've got access to resources. So if they feel misrepresented by an NGO, they can actually do something about it. Whereas a tribal community in rural Zimbabwe is far more challenged. They don't have those connections. They don't have the legal support because the government doesn't really function. And they're like, well, what are we going to do? So it's much easier for an NGO or whoever with a particular agenda to just come and walk all over them. And I think that's just something we should need to be cognizant of. All right. Oh, one more question at the back.
Since we have time, I would like to hear the solutions that you're working on.
Oh, great.
Just a few examples.
All right. Well, what I'm doing is I have certainly I've been, talking to people about these challenges. So, certainly the common ground issue is important. So I'm trying to focus locally and focus on things that are more, less contentious. The wildlife trade is a really contentious issue for all sorts of reasons. So, for example, one of the things I'm doing now is what was mentioned in the introduction, a standard for human-wildlife coexistence. So this is you know, if important protected landscape for, say, elephants in Southern Africa, where there's lots of different stakeholders, there's community groups, there's corridors between protected areas, between, you know, community conserved lands, but there are debates around, well, should we allow hunting for problem elephants? Should there be lethal force, you know, and the benefits of that area, Kavango or Kavango Delta and that surrounding areas, accrue globally, but the costs accrue locally to the people. So setting in place and working with existing standards established by the World Conservation Union, such as the Green List for protected areas, I'm working with them to be, all right, well, what are some of the things we need to do to empower the voice of these local communities so that when there's a debate over should hunting be allowed, that, you know, there's a standard process that, you know, they need to work through and the different stakeholders need to work through, and that, you know, funders acknowledge, and they'd be like, all right, well, we're, you know, KfW, German Development Bank, we want to invest 100 million euros into this landscape. Have you followed the standard of good practice for community engagement, for actually making sure their voices are heard in what you decide to do with the issues with human-elephant conflict and human-elephant coexistence? You're like, all right, we followed this. The structures empower those communities to actually speak up and be like, well, we actually hate elephants, we want them all gone. You're right, well, let's talk about that. Or we really want to hunt them because that's the only way we get benefits, and then that's tabled. And so that's one of the ways I'm working. And so it's locally linked and still trying to work out, well, how would we bring together the global stakeholders and those local communities? So that's in process. And linked to that as well, which I think is quite exciting, is more on the technological side, is how can we use, once you have a standard like that in place for a region or an area, and in places like that, you have, you know, unemployment rates 80% plus. But we have technologies now, you know, in the same way that if you go to fly to LAX and you pick up a taxi, you might pick up an Uber. You've got an app that connects you to the Uber driver. These unemployed people, you know, they're out there, they could go and poach, they could go and cut out the habitat, or they could go and monitor, you know, birds or vegetation. You know, and they're people that would be willing in wealthier parts of the world, urban centers, to actually cover their time for doing that. So we can actually connect the people, the global public willing to pay for this global public good with the people on the ground there, you know, really bearing the costs, and that would take action to conserve these landscapes and the wildlife. And so looking at those systems as well. And so that's very exciting. And certainly on the wildlife trade side at this point, really more trying to, you know, work with and link up the team of people I built up around that issue, Colleen, Hernan, and others, to really just be able to, you know, it takes a lot of energy to engage in that space, and they're more energetic. They haven't been in it for as long, to just be, all right, well, if you want to engage with us, it's messy, but here's some links, here's some things you can do.
We have a question online.
Yep.
Tim asks, is there a good example of a situation where you can quickly summarize where international wildlife trade is clearly benefiting people at a village level, ideally in an African country other than South Africa, and how is that situation managed?
And the question is specifically to sustainable use of wildlife?
Yeah, where the wildlife trade is benefiting folks at a village level.
Right, so at a village level. So there I would, an obvious example that comes to mind, the country I was born in, Namibia, there, I mean, a form of trade is hunting and getting trophy hunters or meat hunters coming in. So there, when South Africa ended its occupation of Namibia in 1990, there was, you know, opportunity for new legislation in there, and communal land, so land owned communally, they were allowed to declare themselves conservancies with access to and the ability to harvest some of their wildlife or sell those harvesting permits to hunters. And importantly, it took, because of the history there and the challenges with forced removals of people, it required a lot of institution building and support, and it needs to be ongoing, including now, but with NGO support, with partnerships between those NGOs present in the landscape and the communities, you know, partnering with government. There are some good examples of systems that work, where those communities are really benefiting. And also, you know, not only in terms of income, but in terms of wildlife numbers, you can really see the benefits as well. So there are examples, but yes, it's challenging, and importantly, it requires a long-term investment, and it's not a silver bullet solution. So one of the real challenges I've run into as well is that the donors from the wealthy countries, often the former colonial powers, are like, all right, we're going to run this project. We want to fix whatever it is in 3 years or 4 years. Go and do this. And then that's not, those messy environments, you're not going to fix in that period of time. You need decades. And so that's a real challenge.
So you mentioned that one way to get people like indigenous folks that have a better voice is to have systems in place.
Mm-hmm.
The example that comes to mind for a time where this didn't go well was in COP26,
Mm-hmm.
where the larger powers were able to push aside smaller powers in order to enforce what they wanted written down in those agreements. So I guess my question is, what do you do when large powers break down those structures that you set?
Well, that's an ongoing challenge, and it's a challenge in this existing space right now. So there are many scholars that have argued in papers. Societies, the Convention of the Trade in Endangered Species. That's exactly what they say has happened. They've been those structures have been, inverted commas, corruptly captured by organizations and in some linked to governments with a lot of power and able to entrench the power. So that's an ongoing challenge. So, and it's going to happen whatever system you set up. An elite will form, the powerful will try and co-opt that system to get what they want. So, I mean, that's an ongoing dance or whatever chess game, what you might want to call it, to continue managing that.
Probably time for one more question. Anyone wants to ask? Once, twice. So, okay, so we'll have the discussion in about 2 minutes in 34. Go ahead, take a break, go outside, get some cool air, it's a bit warm in here. And we'll see you guys over there.